All right, I think we'll get started so that people are able to go to the other sessions they've signed up for this morning. If you are here for qualitative research in a quantitative world, you're in the right place. I'm Felice Phillips. I'm really glad to see everybody. I'm appreciative that you want to start your conference off joining me this morning. And this workshop is going to take the form of a presentation discussion and then some breakout groups and some discussion within those groups. Let me just see what's on chat. Once I start, I can't read the chat as well. So let me just go to the next slide for a minute for housekeeping, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Please remain muted, which everyone has pretty much already done. It's your choice about the video, whether you want to be on or off. I am fine with it either way. I would encourage you to put questions in chat as they come to mind and just keep entering them. I'll read them in full once you're in the breakout groups and try to answer things as much as possible. Follow the groups, answer afterwards when we reconvene, but I can't see the chat while I'm sharing the screen, as you know. And then when we reconvene after breakout groups, we'll leave that open. You can unmute if you want at that point, and we can have a group discussion about the things that or we might want to discuss in full. So I'm going to go back here and just get myself started. I'm going to make sure there isn't anything else on chat one more time. Any problems, people can't hear me, can't see, let me know now. Otherwise, I'm going to get going. All right, great. Well, again, thank you for coming here today. I want to thank the NERA board in particular for inviting me to join them in this annual conference this fall. Really thrilled to talk about this particular session, which is a kind of a passion of mine that as a qualitative researcher, I do often come across a lot of questions, skepticism, some confusion, some pushback about whether qualitative research really is legitimate or viable or actionable or valid. And I think that it's really important to be able to explain, sometimes defend, and certainly give a holistic perspective on the value of qualitative research. And so I have sort of done this tongue-in-cheek because in some ways we live in a world where numbers matter in many cases and words are somehow a lesser God. And so I'm going to take that approach for this particular session and maybe help some of you who are looking to either conduct or have conducted qualitative research to find some ways to answer some of the questions that you might be getting or sensing. And so while qualitative research has been around for a very long time, I thought it would be useful to have a focus on 4 particular aspects of qualitative inquiry that overlap, that are interconnected, that are critical to what defines qualitative research. So I'm just going to go back to the housekeeping screen one more time here, and then I will make sure that we all are going to get started on this. So if there are any questions, I don't see anything in chat. I think we're all good to go. Then let's move on. Okay. So this workshop is for individuals who seek to explain the value, the quality, the rigor, the verity of the qualitative approach. And so I'm going to begin with a brief definition of the characteristics of qualitative research, and very brief. This is not a session about what is qualitative research so much as how that definition of those characteristics help you understand the particular elements we're looking at. And then following a presentation / discussion of this PowerPoint, I'm going to break us into groups and allow people to focus on some particular aspects of not only what we talked about this morning, but what you're struggling with or what you've conducted for research or what you want to talk about. And then when we reconvene, we can cover a lot of very particular questions that people might have. By way of brief introduction, I am currently, my name is Felice Phillips. I'm currently a professor in the Educational Leadership Program at Johnson & Wales University in Providence, Rhode Island. And I teach courses in research methods, dissertation seminar, and organizational behavior and theory in higher education. So I specialize in higher ed cohort focus for students and courses. But I have 4 decades of work as an educational researcher, much of that in private colleges as an educational researcher, institutional researcher, market researcher, where I managed numerous survey research projects, database management, benchmarking, market research. And so for many years, I was plugging away with survey instruments and SPSS, and over time felt that a lot of the story that I wasn't getting from the numbers was hidden somewhere in the perspectives of people who were the respondents who were completing those survey questionnaires. And I migrated over time to mixed methods and then ultimately to specialize in mixed and qualitative methods. And that's really where my focus has been for the last 15 years. And so that's how I come to this topic today. Have been myself very interested in the kinds of questions that I get from people about why qualitative research. I'll cover some of that in a minute. And so I'm not an expert necessarily on, how to answer those questions, but I have given a lot of thought. I've done a lot of deep dives into what the research says and what other scholars say about how to approach this skepticism in audiences and with stakeholders for whom the research might have been conducted and who needs to use those results for their own decision making. So here's a bird's eye view of the agenda today. We're going to move through the presentation. Again, I invite you to use the chat feature, even though I can't always see it. I will go back to it. So we're going to start with what qualitative research is, some essential definitions, and then the central aspects that I want to look at today, the 4 aspects that really interconnect and are critical to understanding how to explain qualitative inquiry to other people. They're the unique nature of qualitative data, qualitative sampling strategies and sample sizes. I'm sure that's been something you've questioned yourself or been asked. The triangulation of qualitative data, in other words, the corroboration of multiple data sets in a qualitative study, and the question of inherent bias and researcher positionality in qualitative research. These are all issues that are distinctive in their own way, but they are very connected and overlap in many ways. Then we'll take some time for breakout groups and then reconvene. So I expect that we will wrap up just before 11 o'clock. So let us get started and dive in here. Let's start with the actual essential qualities of qualitative inquiry. But before we do that, I want to reiterate how long qualitative practice has been in existence. This is not a new phenomena. This is not a new research approach. And again, and I'm not being facetious when I say this, qualitative research as a methodology, as an approach, has been around for centuries. And Herodotus in 484 BC actually conducted a qualitative study on looking at the Greco-Persian Wars. He looked at that cultural impact through documents, through interviews, through observation, to capture the social, political, cultural, geographical context of those wars in the ancient world. So this is not a new phenomenon. And if you look over time, many qualitative researchers have emerged, some of them surprising. Darwin used the observations to develop his own theories. One of my favorites was Max Weber, whose entire theory of bureaucratic practice, span of control, division of labor, hierarchy, was actually grounded in qualitative data, which I find completely ironic. Jane Goodall, Studs Terkel, Alex Haley, all employed the qualitative approach. So this is not something new that has just emerged in the last couple of decades. This is an established practice of engaging with the world. So that brings us to the present day, and I just want to read this slide. This is a composite from some of the gurus in the field, Lincoln, Guba, Saldana. Qualitative research is a situated activity. It locates the researcher in the natural world, in the world in which we live, and it consists of interpretive material practices that make that world visible, the unseen seen, the unknown known. And these transform our understanding of the world through the eyes and experiences of other people. It is a customized, inductive, emergent process, purposefully adapting lenses, filters, and angles as we view life and as we see that life through the eyes of other people. And then there is a groundbreaking definition that I find from Strauss and Corbin, who are the gurus from the 1960s with grounded theory. And they put another spin on it and say that qualitative research refers to the exploration about people's lives, lived experiences, behaviors, emotions, feelings, as well as organizational functioning, social movements, cultural phenomena, and interactions between large and small groups of people. So you get the gist that this is about people in the world and their unique perspectives on their lives in the world. But I think it's important to also note that qualitative research is definitely part of the larger research universe. It's grounded in the scientific method. For our purposes, it is applied to educational projects. But if research is an organized, systematic, disciplined approach to answering questions about what we see and experience, then qualitative research is no less structured or precise, allowing us to understand and uncover the human experience. So it focuses on generating meaning and constructing meaning within the environments in which we engage with the people in the study. So it is, in fact, a legitimate research approach. The characteristics, and I'm going to go through this list fairly quickly, reflect those definitions that I just read to you. The roots of qualitative research, and this is an important thing to keep in mind, evolve from a variety of social science disciplines, and some of the more common ones that you might understand: health sciences, psychology, philosophy, political science, sociology, anthropology, history. These are the roots of the characteristics of qualitative research, the practice of qualitative research, and many of the approaches, many of the research designs evolve from those disciplines. And so let's go through this list because you'll see a lot of the characteristics kind of surface from those discipline approaches. First, qualitative research is naturalistic. This just means that you as the researcher go to where people live and work and experience life. It is not research conducted in a controlled environment. It is not in a laboratory. It is not in a clinical setting. You engage in the world with your participants. Second, qualitative research is inductive, which means that the researcher starts with a hunch or a set of observations about what they see or experience and develop a plan to ground data, to collect data, to sort of support what that hunch tells them and to build to the specifics, to the meaning, to the patterns that evolve from the data that's collected based on that hunch. So it's from the ground up as opposed to deductive, which is the root of quantitative inquiry. It also then goes to this next item, purposeful sampling. Sampling in a qualitative project is non-probability. It is purposeful. The participants and the data sources are handpicked. They are intentionally selected. They are not intended for generalization of results to a larger population. And this is a very important element that people often get tripped up on. So and we will circle back to this in more detail. But as Patton says, these are hand-selected cases or data sources that are considered information rich. And it is an important element of the intentionality of qualitative research. Which leads us to the next element here, multiple data sources which are triangulated in a qualitative study. If you have smaller sets of data, then you need multiple sets of data to corroborate or to reinforce or to confirm or to supplement what you have found in a study. And multiple data sources mean that a qualitative study goes deep rather than broad. You know, the breadth is what you find in a quantitative project where you cast the net wide and you get many, many responses. You may get far fewer responses in a qualitative study, but you know more about each individual, each data source. So you're digging deeper, but then you triangulate various sources of data to see if there's a common core of meaning. And again, we're going to revisit this. Participant perspectives and stories. So each person grounds their reality in their own experience, their own perspective, and the researcher in a qualitative study wants to know what those unique perspectives are all about. And so the participant is central to this study. And their stories, their lived experiences are central to the qualitative endeavor. Emergent design. This is a really hard one for a lot of people. I can tell you that if you are a person that likes to set a plan, you like it to be, absolute, you don't want to deviate from the plan, you are not going to enjoy qualitative research. Qualitative research truly is emergent. And this emergent design implies and means that your design could morph or change, your data sources could evolve or change, your research questions almost certainly will change, your data collection strategy may change. And this is a natural outcome of an inductive study where things evolve over time. I will say that for the most part, most qualitative studies have minor changes. The emergent element is not drastic, but I have conducted studies or worked with students who have conducted studies where the actual research design changed from, for instance, qualitative descriptive to qualitative phenomenological, not totally out of the realm of possibility. And so this makes some people a little uncomfortable. If you are good with ambiguity and fluidity, this is the place for you. Exploring phenomena in the natural world, our next characteristic is that the root of qualitative research is about phenomena or phenomenon in the world around us, what we live, see, experience, touch, smell, taste. That is the root of a qualitative exploration. It's about what we absorb and intuit and engage in with other people. And so there's a very intimate relationship that's established as the researcher to the researched. Finally, this last one, the researcher as instrument. This notion is critical to understanding qualitative research. Makes me a little crazy because people use this expression incorrectly in a lot of ways. Let's go to the next slide so I can actually pursue this a bit. This one is really misused in a lot of ways. And when you think about what it means, some people misinterpret it immediately to think that you don't need instrumentation or tools for qualitative research, data collection, because the researcher takes care of it all, which is a fallacy. It's completely inaccurate, but it is implied in the way it's framed. People misunderstand it for that reason. What it really means is that the distance or the relationship or the intimacy between the researcher and the researched is close. This is all about the distance. It's all about the relationship that's established between the researcher engaging with the participants, the individuals, for a study. And the closer that relationship, the better the quality of data, the more detail, the more richness of detail you'll elicit from a participant if you establish trust, rapport, some kind of connection with the people that you are talking to or engaging with in your study. And so when people use this term, they often think that there is no precision, there is no instrumentation, there is no need to establish a plan for how to collect data. But let me be clear, for every data source, for every distinct source of data in a qualitative study, you must have a qualitative instrument or tool to collect that data. So what does it mean, the researcher as instrument? It means the researcher is the conduit between the data and the tool. It is the person who engages with the people in the study to get the best data possible and use the tools to collect it by virtue of the relationship that's been established. I have heard people say to me a lot, this means you don't need instruments for a study. This means you just scribble down whatever happens. If you do that, you will collect garbage and you can't base a study on garbage. To get really high quality data, you must have an established relationship where the instruments can be used by the researcher with the research. So this is just a pass over to make sure that you understand the when you use qualitative, when you don't. Again, most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this. But when should this approach be used? By and large, it's considered exploratory in many ways as a research approach when either little is known about a subject or something new is being pursued about a topic, or when there is a gap in how something has been studied previously with a population, with an approach, with a setting. You're exploring processes or phenomena, you are gaining insights into the way people live, you're understanding processes or events, i.e. case studies, for instance. But also qualitative research is essential to support quantitative and mixed methods studies, either for instrument development in one of those approaches, or to add an element, a qualitative element to an otherwise quantitative pursuit. And so the strength of the qualitative approach is really in a holistic interpretive approach, uncovering the human experience, but it can be partnered with, and often is partnered with, quantitative or mixed methods studies. So I'm going to take one more stab here at positioning qualitative research in the world of research. How does qualitative research compare with quantitative and mixed? And what is a paradigm, essentially? So I'm looking at this, I'm calling it a worldview paradigm. It reflects how an individual views the world, the order of the world, how you understand reality, how you understand truth. If you are a person who's naturally inclined to believe there is a single truth, there is a single answer to a research problem, then you are really more oriented towards positivistic or post-positivistic orientations in the quantitative paradigm. You believe that truth can be measured and is objective and can be basically found out by very precise methods that are measurable and attained through the quantitative approach. But if you are comfortable with multiple realities, that if in the end your orientation to truth is that there are multiple ways to see a single experience, that there are multiple truths, then it really means that you are more comfortable with the qualitative approach, which is about social constructivist, people making meaning of their own worlds, the multiple reality view. So Guba defines paradigm as a basic set of beliefs that guide one's actions. I always encourage people to think about where their orientation is in terms of research. If you find yourself inclined more to the absolute versus the multiple reality view, then you should pay attention to that as to where you're going to be most comfortable in terms of conducting research. There are 3 established research paradigms: quantitative, qualitative, and mixed. There are others, for instance, Creswell and Creswell promote the transformative research paradigm. I don't necessarily ascribe to that as something that is separate and apart. The transformative stance is one which is about advocacy, social justice, representation of unheard voices. I tend to want to see that perspective embedded in all 3 paradigms, but that's an example of how other worldviews or other paradigms are discussed in the world of scholarship, of researchers. I don't want to leave it out, but it's all about how you see reality and view truth. And so I've created a continuum just to give you a sense of how that might show you another way to look at this. And it's also important to sort of do the comparison here between qualitative and quantitative one more time. So quantitative seeks to establish findings that can be generalized to a larger population, where qualitative is naturalistic or social constructivist, multiple realities that are not intended for generalization. Quantitative, the researcher operates from a distance and independent from the data. Qualitative, the researcher is immersed in the data and the sources of data. Quantitative pursuits have the goal of developing a body of knowledge that stands over time. Qualitative data are established to be supplemented or emergent and build on multiple views of a single phenomena. They address the same questions in different ways, and their key roots are very different. And so essentially for all 3 paradigms, the focus, the philosophical roots, the assumptions, and the practices differ. But one of the favorite things that Patton talks about and Silverman talks about as well is that in the world of research, nothing is entirely without some aspect of these other paradigms. So if you have a qualitative study, sometimes some quantitative aspects creep in and vice versa. And I think that there commentary is important to consider whenever you conduct any project, because there is no absolute in anything in the world at all. So let's dive into the four elements, the four issues that I want to cover today, to look at why some audiences are skeptical of the qualitative approach. And one thing that I want to say is that you, as researchers, are going to encounter people who want to use your research and will be skeptical if it's a qualitative project. And there are some people you will never be able to convince, and that is true in anything in life. So, it's not to say that they're wrong and you're right, or that they're right and you're wrong. But there are really a lot of instances where you have to prepare a study, and the findings have to be shared with a group of people who need that information to make decisions, to develop strategy, to develop policy. And you have to tailor what you're doing to what they need or what they are willing to accept. If you are able to explain your project and qualitative aspects in a way where you can persuade people that there is verity and viability to your project, great. But I don't want to mislead anyone into thinking that everyone is persuadable, because that's not necessarily the case. And I have had many experiences where people have walked out on students' dissertation defenses because they didn't believe that qualitative research was valid. I've had people tell me that they couldn't make decisions based on the research data that I was sharing. So there is absolute skepticism out there. But I picked these particular aspects because these are things that represent some of the questions I have heard most often, and some of the things that I find are most challenging to try and address with people. So let's take them one by one. Just going to take a minute and see if there's anything in chat that I need to make sure. Okay, everybody looks okay. Hope you're still with me. We go to the nature. So we're going to start with the nature of qualitative data. And one of the things, okay. Thank you. You guys are good. I appreciate it. It's like talking to a black box when you're on a screen share. Qualitative data is drastically different from the measurable testing type of data that you encounter in a quantitative project. I sort of refer to qualitative data as the way we live. We live qualitatively. We talk to each other. We engage with each other. We use our senses to live in the world. I have a colleague who has a very official terminology she uses for qualitative data, which is that she calls it mushy squishy. I think that's pretty official. And she finds it to be just too changeable. And this is what I mean about some people who are not comfortable with the qualitative approach. But if you think about qualitative data, part of the challenge of qualitative data is that it's about what people say and see and observe and feel and emote and tell you about. And even what you read in terms of documentation, or what you see in terms of symbolism. So it's not something you can get your arms around as easily. You have to find other ways to approach it. And since the very essence of qualitative data is non-numerical, it is in fact textual, visual, verbal, then it differs significantly in what it looks like and how you approach it. So I'm going to take 2 slides to approach not only the types and sources of qualitative data, and the list is extensive, but it is, again, a reminder that this is the way we live in the world. And to capture some of this data through a research project, thank you for you putting questions in. I appreciate that. I'll get to those. I really will. We speak through these particular vehicles. So let's go through each of these types of data so that you can understand a little bit about what the labels mean. I do hear very often people who are new to the qualitative approach, people who don't know a lot about qualitative research, say a couple of things to me all the time. One is, oh, qualitative research, that's just interviewing people. Well, that's one of the ways you obtain qualitative data, but that's not the only way. Or they automatically go to, oh, that's just about conducting focus groups. while interviews and focus groups are in the world of qualitative data sources, we have all these others. So let me go through this list and tell you a little bit about them. And then the next slide is going to be how you actually collect these data in this particular way. So words, conversations, stories. People orally, verbally describe their experiences or their perspectives, either alone or in groups, by telling you about themselves, their experience, their life, whatever you are asking them about. And so words, conversations, storytelling is an essential piece of qualitative data. But this next one, synergistic discussions, is when you have a group of people that are guided by the researcher, and I mean focus groups, structured discussions that build on synergy that is created among the people who are in the group. So this is a little different than an interview because the researcher is guiding the conversation to produce a certain kind of synergy where the group then talks to each other and the researcher stands back, as opposed to the first set of data, words, conversations, stories, where the researcher engages with the individual or individuals to tell stories or describe things or listen to conversations and is a full participant in that. So you have words, conversations, stories, and synergistic discussions. You have observations. The researcher observes and records the nonverbal and contextual behaviors and interactions of individuals and groups, either in formal settings, informal settings, what they see, and importantly, what they don't see, what's not being observed. So that's another major source of qualitative data. Next, we have conversations and discourse interactions. So how is this different from the first bullet? Conversational or discourse analysis is a process whereby the researcher, generally as a non-participant, observes, sort of stands on the sidelines of people who are engaged in conversation or discourse of some type to understand how people talk to each other, the tone of voice, the turn taking, the power distribution, the engagement levels. It's a form of observing and hearing stories or discourse. It is a very important part of qualitative data collection, not used as often in, let's say, dissertation research or applied research, but it is an essential piece and one that people don't always know about. Next, we have documents, artifacts, material culture. So again, documentation, extant evidence that is available in the world for people to read, to see, to absorb, and it can be anything. The list is very, very long. Meeting minutes, website messaging, emails, policy statements, news releases, catalogs, you name it. You have a list of documents, documentation that people leave as a trail of evidence that are used as qualitative data sources. Artifacts are usually tangible, viewable. They can be buildings, architecture, symbolism, painting, wayfinding on a college campus. And material culture, which covers both of these aspects, is really used in ethnography for the cultural forms and markings that a group of people, an intact cultural group, use to define themselves. So these are all essential pieces that are used as data in qualitative studies. And finally, we get to this reflection diary journal piece. And this is where the participants in the study record at the request of the researcher or have already recorded their reflections, their diary entries, journals that are either on their own initiative or by prompts, that are forms of reflective practice, debriefing, closure, psychological insight, all of this data. So all of these particular categories comprise the world of qualitative data, which is far more than just connecting people through an interview. So I make the point here before we get to the next slide so that you can see that this is a very comprehensive and full range of data sources. So how are these data collected? How are they used in studies? Interviews, narratives, stories, those are all where the storytelling comes into play. So the words are captured, the words and the stories are captured in these interviews or narrative exchanges between the researcher and the researched. The synergistic conversations are captured in focus groups or dyads and triads. It's another whole conversation, but dyads are a focus group of type with 2 people and the researcher, triads 3 people and the researcher, but focus groups by and large are 4 or more people facilitated by a moderator. Observed realities are captured through rubrics or documents that the researcher creates to take note of the observed realities, either if they're fully engaged with the group or as a non-participant. Then you have rubrics that are designed to gather extant evidence in documentation, artifacts, material culture. Conversational or discourse analyses are categorized in logs or notebooks, and that is real-time conversations that a researcher records. And then reflective practices are usually captured in documents like journals, diaries, or open-ended questions, questionnaires that a researcher creates in different formats to debrief a participant after an interview, after a conversation, or to ask them to reflect on a scenario, free word association, something that captures their perception of an experience. And so we have established the range of qualitative data and the ways those data are collected. And that gives you a feel for this very broad field of the nature of qualitative data. So I want to move, now that we know that we have data that is an enormous opportunity for qualitative researchers to capture in many different ways, this whole confusing world of qualitative sampling is one that really causes trouble for people. And the vast difference, and I'm going to just sort of state this off at the beginning of this conversation. One of the main reasons that people struggle with qualitative sampling is that in the world we live in, there is the understanding, the assumption that sampling must be probability-based, and it must be for the purpose of sampling a group that you can study so that you can then generalize those findings in a representative way to a larger population, a universe that represents that sample, so that those findings can be applied and action can be taken. In fact, that has nothing to do with qualitative sampling. Researchers often fail to understand the usefulness of studying small samples found in qualitative projects. And this is related to that misapprehension that generalizability is and always should be the ultimate goal of all good research. But that does not apply to qualitative research. And in fact, an appropriate sample size for qualitative studies is just one that answers the research question. And the goal then is to single out those individuals, those cases that will provide the information needed to answer the research question, but not necessarily anything to do with generalizing findings. In fact, you don't generalize findings in a qualitative study. And so qualitative inquiry focuses on intentionally small sample sizes, sometimes even single cases, selected purposefully to permit inquiry into the understanding of a phenomenon in depth from the perspective of each individual in that phenomenon. And the quantitative methods aim for much larger, statistically representative sample sizes because they are trying to generalize the results. So right away, you have this chasm between qualitative and quantitative sampling because their purposes are different. But when you have people who are skeptical about qualitative sampling, they believe that it is a flawed approach because you can't generalize the findings, because the samples are too small to do that. You have to bear in mind that is not what qualitative sampling aims to do. And so the approaches are very different and the purposes are very different. And in fact, where many people who are skeptical feel that this is a weakness in qualitative sampling, it is in fact the strength of qualitative sampling that you intentionally select your individuals or your data sets, because it then becomes the intended focus to answer the question. So let's look for a minute here. Again, just make sure. It is. I know I'm going to have a lot of questions on this, and I'll do my best to answer, but I don't have all the answers either, so I struggle with it myself. Big point here. Remember, qualitative sampling is non-probability sampling, small sample sizes, and I mean small. You will find some studies where people will say, yeah, 50 people were interviewed. That's not the norm. You know, for most of the research designs and qualitative research, the norm of the number of people you might interview or the number of focus groups you might conduct is small. You might have a study where you interview between 8 and 11 people, and that tells you everything you need to know. And that is really hard for people to believe, but it is true. And it goes to this last bullet point, which I'll talk about in a minute, data saturation, and I will circle back. But not seeking a statistical representation of a larger population is fine. You actually still get actionable results. You get the truth. You will find an amazing way of people to tell their stories and come together with a common core of understanding. And so I always feel like people don't believe this is what's going to happen, but you single out, let's say 10 people that are going to be in your study, and you support that with a few contextual interviews from experts or people that are not in the primary interview group, and you look at some documentation, and maybe you do some reflective practices, and you think, I'm just going to get a whole lot of words and stories and information, and what am I going to do with all of it? And within a very short time, and I promise you this really does happen, this story emerges, this common core experience, these common elements just start to adhere to one another. And it's a very common experience that you then, without even knowing it, you hear the story, the truth, the reality that comes out of these disparate people, these disparate sources talking about the same thing. So all qualitative sampling seeks are information-rich cases, people or sources that will yield the best information to answer the research questions for your study. And there are numerous qualitative sampling strategies. And the overview of qualitative sampling is considered purposeful or purposive. The words are interchangeable, but they come from different roots, but we use purposeful more commonly. That is the baseline. That's the umbrella for how you sample in qualitative research. But there are sub-strategies, up to about 40 of them, that have very different approaches that help you as the researcher find the right people and the right sources for your study. So let's focus on this notion of intentionality and what it really means in terms of the characteristics. There are ways that researchers identify who is really suitable for their study. And when you intentionally choose people, you recruit them with intentionality as well. So this is not the same as random sampling, as stratified sampling, as multi-cluster, multi-stage sampling. This is literally saying, I know Jane is a person who's had this experience, and she would be a great person to talk to in my study. Now, if you are quantitatively oriented and feel that that is way too personal and way too biased and way too intimate, this is where you'll have trouble conducting a qualitative study or even convincing someone else that it's a valid approach. But as a qualitative researcher, there's no less truth in talking to Jane than in having Jane and lots of Jane's friends answer a survey questionnaire. You will get a lot of the same information. And since I spent many years conducting survey research, I can tell you that there are truths in all of these approaches. But you start with an intentional, purposeful approach, and then you go to these sub-strategies. And I'm just going to list a few. This is not to be comprehensive at all, but it gives you some reassurance that there are very precise approaches to how to sample for a qualitative study. It is not, I'm just going to name a few names and that's going to be it. There is intentionality in the strategies and the sub-strategies for selecting data sources for your study. So we have things like criterion-based sampling, where you select individuals or sources that meet specific criterion for your study. And it can be that someone has worked at a place for 5 years and has certain credentials and is, and has a particular level of experience in an organization. So criterion-based sampling. There's maximum variation sampling, which is to ensure a cross-section of experiences and perspectives from people in the study. So this is as close as you're going to get to representation in some ways, but it's not representative. It's considered a cross-section, not representative. But still, maximum variation sampling. Critical case, where you go to single individuals who have been known to experience something no one else has experienced. Confirming, disconfirming sampling. Snowball sampling, that is when you consult with a participant and you ask them to suggest somebody else who's had a similar experience or perspective, and you go to that person. Opportunistic sampling, where the researcher in the middle of the study decides there's more that they need to know about X, and they develop more data sources. Key informant selection, time location sampling, often used in case studies, expert or elite sampling, the list goes on. And while I may sound like I'm speaking gibberish in some ways, I list all of these sub-strategies to reassure people that there is a lot of precision, a lot of careful planning in selecting the data sources for a qualitative study. Let's go to one more thing here on sampling. These are the kinds of questions I get or statements I get all the time. Can't base critical decisions on the perspectives of a few people. Qualitative sampling does not allow for a representative mix in a population. The sample sizes are too small. The samples are too biased. You yourself can probably list lots of things you've heard or lots of things you think yourself about sampling. But this is a major stumbling block for people. And for those who are engaged in qualitative sampling, you have to embrace the fact that while it is different from probability sampling, it is still valid. In many ways, you will get a core truth that emerges quite fast. And there are really no rules for sample size. You know, when people say, well, what should I be aiming for? Or how many people should I be talking to? This is where it's really hard for people, because the answer is, it depends. It depends on your study. It depends on the nature of your research question. But it also depends on this thing called data saturation. And I'm going to circle back to this. I referenced it a few slides ago. Data saturation is when you, as the researcher, get to a point in your data collection where you have heard, observed, seen, listened to the same information, the same stories, the same behaviors repeatedly. They don't have to be in exactly the same words. They don't have to be exactly the same behavior. But you, as the researcher, grounded in the literature, grounded in the research frame, you begin to understand that these same things bubble up repeatedly. It's called data saturation. It is a form of repetitive data collection patterning. And what it tells you is that you have hit on a truth or a group of truths, and it happens pretty quickly. So for instance, if I'm going to design a study and I'm going to interview, my range of interviewees is 8 to 11 people in a phenomenological study on how people recover from cancer. And I know from experience that somewhere around my 6th interview, that data saturation point is going to start to evolve. And by the 8th interview, certainly by the 9th interview, I will start to hear the same things over and over and over. That core truth, the meaning of those experiences, will be very evident. I can literally predict what people are going to say if I go to interview 10 and 11. Data saturation is an important element in reaffirming the sample sizes may be small in a qualitative study, but they still produce meaning, truth, or the truth of the people involved in the study. And it's very unique to qualitative studies, but it supports the small sample sizes and the viability of what you're collecting in terms of data. And so this is one of the pieces that goes with this. All right, so let's move on to the triangulation of the data. So we've talked about the nature of data. We talked about the sample sizes, sampling approaches to qualitative data. So now let's look at these data that you're collecting. One of the critical pieces in qualitative studies is this procedure, this set of strategies to ensure quality, rigor, verity, and viability of a qualitative project. And this construct of trustworthiness, in which triangulation is a piece, first conceived by Lincoln and Guba in the 1980s, is considered the gold standard for this baseline of rigor and quality in qualitative work. And by employing the trustworthiness strategies that they discuss, and I'm going to show you in the next slide what they are, the researcher is able to convey great confidence in the findings and the viability of those findings. So triangulation, or the corroboration of multiple data sources within a single study, is one element in credibility and also confirmability in trustworthiness. So it's part of the toolkit. And we're going to look at the entire construct of trustworthiness so that you understand where triangulation fits in. And then we're going to move quickly to triangulation. So let's go to what trustworthiness is. And this is really how Lincoln and Guba define this in their book, Naturalistic Inquiry, in 1985. This was really sort of the groundbreaking book that recatapulted qualitative research back into the research world. But they define it as a way to evaluate the worth of a qualitative study and to ensure others, consumers of the research or generators of the research, that the study is viable. I'm going to look at the particular elements, and you'll see that triangulation has a piece in here. So these are the four original pieces. The last piece, authenticity, is the fifth that's been added over time based on discourse in the research field with qualitative researchers. But this first element, credibility, and you'll see in parens, I've put in the correlates to the quantitative perception of validity and reliability constructs. But credibility in trustworthiness is confidence in the truth of the findings in a qualitative study. Transferability, applying those findings to other contexts. Dependability, that the findings can be consistent no matter how many times you conduct the study with the same instruments, the same population, the same approach. Confirmability, that there is a degree of neutrality or that the study is shaped by the respondents and not by the researcher's bias. We are going to get to bias next. And then authenticity, which was added later on, that all realities are in fact represented as experienced. All right, so you can see that I've got these elements here. This is a chart, a conversion chart that I created. I have credibility is misspelled. I apologize for that. But this is a chart that I created so that you can see the quantitative lens in this category, in this column, the qualitative, the bridge, and the essential question. And this helps people understand that trustworthiness is a construct which has been used by qualitative researchers to ensure that results are believable, they appear truthful, they're consistent, they're applicable, and they can be corroborated. So you see that there are ways that qualitative researchers can use each one of these to strengthen the study, to convince others that the study is viable. So for each one of these, for credibility, for instance, triangulation is one of the strategies you would use for credibility of a study. Peer debriefing, member checking, where you go back to the people in your study and you ask them to look at a summary of what you've constructed to see if you have represented the conversations with them or the engagement with them in a way that they think reflects the conversation. Many of you have probably heard of member checking. Excuse me, reliability, sorry, dependability is often conducted by external audits. People who have nothing to do with the study come in and they audit the entire study to see if those are dependable findings. Transferability, is the study conducted in such a way with sufficient detail and sufficient corroboration across data sets that those findings can be applied to people in similar settings, similar populations, much like generalizability, and the confirmability that if in fact you triangulate multiple data sources or data sets in a single qualitative study, you will come up with the same truths, the same findings. And that's where we're going to focus today. I've spoken about accuracy as representing realities, but each one of these, with their correlate in the quantitative world, you can see it still seeks the same goal. Now, I will say historically, the view of how to assess a study's validity, the data reliability, the objectivity has been rooted in the quantitative perspective. No one has really completed a review or translated the same quantitative criteria into the applications wholly for a qualitative study. And it's not really doable. Some of the quantitative applications of validity or reliability are grounded in true score theory. So you can't really just make a transfer over. So what Lincoln and Guva have done here in this discussion about trustworthiness and these particular elements that apply is to find correlates, ways that a qualitative researcher can say that their research, their procedures, their design, their findings are just as viable as those in a quantitative project. I'm going to look at triangulation then as one of the key strategies, and one that you can use to reassure stakeholders or audiences that care has been taken to cover your tracks, that you have collected data on the same phenomena, on the same research question from multiple sources. And so that is what triangulation is, that you identify multiple sources of data, methods, analysts, or theories that are compared and contrasted to strengthen the verity and the robust quality of a study. There are 4 types of triangulation, and let's just take a quick look at those. Data, methods, theorist, and analyst. These are very common approaches to triangulation, and usually the first 2, data triangulation and methods triangulation, are the most common that you see in a study. But data triangulation is using a variety of data sources in a single study. So you might interview teachers and students and building leaders and administrators, and that might be a variety of data sources. You triangulate on those 4 separate data sources where there is a common core of truth. Methods triangulation is multiple methods. So instead, you might use, and you can have different populations, but let's say you have a single population of students. And for that single population, you conduct focus groups with some of them, interviews, depth interviews with some of them, open-ended questionnaires and reflectives with some of them, observation or discourse analysis with some of them. So methods triangulation is, do you find the same truth coming at it from different methodological approaches? The theorist triangulation is that you use a theoretical framework or conceptual framework to design the study, to leverage elements of theory to study a research problem. This is usually not done in isolation. It's usually a triangulation approach used in conjunction with data or methods triangulation, but very often is used in a qualitative study. Theory is used in qualitative research. And analyst triangulation. So I've been part of teams where we did inter-rater coding. This is analyst triangulation. We each independently took raw transcripts of focus groups, and we each independently coded and developed themes for those transcripts. And then we came together to see what we had. That is a form of triangulation, and it's a very common one that's used on research teams. All of these will lead you to establish a core truth for a study and to reassure those who are hearing your findings and observing, listening to what you're saying, that care was taken to corroborate findings and results from these multiple sources or these multiple approaches. All right, so we're going to move on to inherent bias, and this one is a little bit more complicated. But it's a big issue. People inherently believe that when you are personally involved with respondents or participants in a study, when there are only a few participants in a study or a few data sources, when in fact you are asking them to describe personal experiences, that there's way too much bias. This is going to skew the results. This can't possibly be valid. This can't be actionable. And this really is where a lot of studies are rejected by people who are uncomfortable with this emergent fluid approach to lived experiences of humans. There's always someone who says, too much subjectivity, I can't handle this. You may never persuade people who are really uncomfortable with that kind of intimate relationship between the researcher and the researched, that a qualitative study can yield results that are very actionable. But if you find that you have people who are open to why this is particularly workable, there are a couple of things that you need to remember here. And the researcher in a qualitative study will automatically be connected to their participants, their individuals, in ways that are very close. But that is the goal of the qualitative approach. And so let's look at these three aspects. We're going to break them down. First, the researcher relationship with the researched. It is the absolutely essential core of a qualitative study that a researcher must engage intimately and closely with the people they are researching. Number two, epoche or bracketing and researcher positionality. Where does the researcher's role come into play in a study? And what is it that the researcher knows or has experienced or is familiar with that can be put aside, as Moustakis or Hersel even refer to, stand aside, stand back, put aside? Where does the researcher make space for the voices of those that are predominantly speaking in a qualitative study? So this is an essential piece of qualitative research, and it addresses the issue of bias and positionality, allows for the voices of the participants to dominate the assumptions of what the researcher thinks those voices are saying. Finally, this last element, reflexivity, self-awareness, contextual sensitivity, these are also elements which are very critical to understanding how bias strengthens particular elements of a qualitative study rather than compromises it. So if you're not thoroughly confused by now, let's go to this nature of the relationship. We're almost finished. The role of the researcher in data collection is one of establishing a relationship of trust, of rapport, being empathic, emotional connection, non-judgmental, and this means creating a safe space for developing a working relationship. And this is considered contextual sensitivity. In other words, the qualitative researcher has to really work at leaving room for the participant to feel safe and able to tell their story without the researcher imposing their own experience or assumptions on those stories. And they must lead with that. The researcher must disclose and be transparent with the people they're engaged with, that they are practicing that standing back, that what Patton calls the confessional disposition, which I find a very interesting term, which is about creating that trust, that candor, and that disclosure, which leads us to bracketing or epoche. So this is an issue of distance, disclosure, context. And these are two terms that are used and are largely associated with phenomenological design, but are used broadly for positionality stances as well. So bracketing was first established by Hersel, who was considered the father of phenomenology in the late 19th century. And he defined bracketing as the researcher holding the phenomena under study under close inspection and sort of dissecting it, understanding how to break apart the phenomena that he or she was studying, and deconstructing it in a way where then you broke down your assumptions about the phenomenon and allowed the participants in the study to share what they were experiencing or seeing. But when we go to the word epoche, which was constructed by Moustakis in the 1990s, who's considered the father of modern phenomenology, he took a much more specific approach to it and defined it as a way for the researcher to stand back, to disclose what they knew, what they believed, what they'd experienced, and that they were consciously and intentionally making space for the participants' voices to dominate. The researcher then has to look at themselves in a way where they become aware of their personal bias, They eliminate their involvement with the subject matter, acknowledge their preconceptions, adjust their attitude. And so in a way, it's a way of suspending judgment, of also consciously disclosing their political, their cultural, their social biases, if there are those that would weigh heavily in a study. And so how are epoche and bracketing related? Epoche requires the standing back process to occur, followed by the reduction of the phenomenon. And in this way, the researcher then brackets out the rest of the world and leaves space for the researched. This is an important piece here. And I know that it sounds confusing. I'm going to go to reflexivity, which is even more confusing, but let's just see where we are here. So we have inherent bias, the researcher's position in relationship to the participants or the research site allows space for those voices to dominate, not the researcher's opinion to dominate. And that relationship, contextually sensitive, confessional disposition, the researcher allows that space for trust to be formed. We now look at the practice of reflexivity. And this, for those who have conducted a study and have kept a reflexive journal, will know what I'm talking about. Reflexivity is a major construct in qualitative research. Patton has an excellent section on reflexivity. There are entire books written on reflexivity. It's often used in ethnographic studies where the researcher must practice self-awareness and a type of reflection that allows for being self-questioning. And so it means that there's an element of reflection in reflexivity. What is the difference? Well, reflexivity is when the researcher encompasses reflection on what they see or hear or believe, but they take the reflective process deeper, make it more systematic. They connect to different aspects by stressing the importance of deep introspection, political consciousness, cultural awareness, ownership of one's perspective. This is what I mean about keeping a journal. If you are conducting a qualitative study, from the very beginning of the study, I encourage people to keep a reflexive journal where they track the different aspects of what they're observing about what they see, what they feel, what they find themselves inclined to think or assume, those disclosures about where they feel they are biased, where they feel that they are judgmental, where they feel that they've already decided on what something should be or what they're going to hear. And researchers often maintain these journals as a form of mindfulness because it really allows them to more transparently understand the findings and to interpret those findings without the imposition of their own opinion or assumption layered on. If that's not totally confusing, I hope that it makes a certain amount of sense. One of the things that I appreciate about a researcher, England, she commented in 1994 that a reflexive stance is critical to self-awareness, self and sympathetic introspection in a qualitative exercise on the part of the researcher to ensure verity in data collection, findings, analysis, and interpretation. Those are the four pieces that I find most confusing for people who are conducting or trying to explain qualitative research. And so as we wrap up, what does this all mean? What does it tell us about the strength, the value, the rigor, the quality, the verity of a qualitative project? First, the design and the procedural elements of a qualitative project are interdependent, overlapping, and fluid. And if you are uncomfortable with that fluidity and that overlapping nature, you are likely to be very frustrated with qualitative research and even less likely to be able to convince somebody else that qualitative research is viable. You have to practice the stance of being a qualitative researcher to kind of find your own approach and your own style. But if you pursue that and you do find that you are finding it rewarding in some way, you will become very comfortable with this practice. And as Patton or Silverman note, you will ultimately find yourself following the threads of a qualitative study. Or in other words, the study will lead you where the data wants to be found. Another great quote from them. Second, qualitative research, like all research, is rooted in the scientific model of systematic procedures, empirically derived data, carefully planned procedures and precision, and appropriate and sensitive ethical boundaries. Qualitative research is no less scientific or methodological approach than any other project. Next, qualitative research ensures rich, descriptive, sensory data that is verified through the corroboration of multiple sources in a single study to identify common patterns and themes of meaning for that study to answer the research question. So the nature of the data may differ from a quantitative data set, but the outcome is still verifiable and actionable. And finally, qualitative research does not attempt to be statistically representative of a larger universe. It's not intended for generalizability. Its purpose focuses on the particularity and peculiarity of small sets or single cases studied in great depth to understand the unique experiences of the individual. So it's intentionally limited. It is about depth rather than breadth. And it is based on the intimate relationship between the researcher and the researched in a way where the rapport is established between the researcher and the researched to allow for deep description, details, and deep understanding of each person's experience and meaning. So in this instance, the researcher has a responsibility to the researched to be mindful, self-aware, and empathic and open, but to stand back enough so that their bias does not overcome the study. I don't claim absolute truth in any of this. As I've mentioned, I have been conducting qualitative research, for years. I have encountered all of these problems. I've tried to explain all of these things to people who are disbelievers. I've had some pretty remarkable things said to me, but I have on occasion been able to convince people to cross over to the dark side and join me in the qualitative world. The kinds of things that people say, can be surprising, but you also would be surprised at your own power of persuasion if you feel that there's value in what you're studying and what you're doing and what you're conducting. So I am going to move to breakout groups. Let me stop sharing here for a minute after I read these questions, and you can take a screenshot, but I'll put these into the chat as well. I'm going to break us into groups of 3 or 4 people each, and I'm going to give you a half an hour or so to talk to each other about some of the challenges you faced in your own projects, or if you're considering a project, what's holding you back from starting it, and describing your studies or your proposed study to one another. And each of these elements that I've talked about today, the nature of the data, the sampling issues, the triangulation issues, and the bias issues, where is it that you get hung up the most, or where is it that you've had pushback the most, if you haven't? And then we'll reconvene and come back to, let me just put the gallery back here. Okay. So I'm going to look at chat here for a minute. Let's see if there are any questions before I break into groups. Okay. All right, so I'm going to read some of these questions, but I am going to put people in groups. And if you have to leave, I totally understand that. That's fine. But I'm going to check in with the groups as I can. And let me just. Okay, so I'm going to create the groups. So if there's any reason why you want to chat, tell me what's not possible, you can't go in a group or you have to leave, that's fine. Otherwise, I'll circulate around and I'll bring us all back in about a half an hour. So. Tanya, are you not in a group? You can unmute, and tell me. If you've been kicked out of a room, let me know and I'll put you back in.
I don't know which room I am in. I happen to be the only person in the room. Hello? Hello, everyone.